Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the City of Casey Council meeting on the 18th of August. I'd like to welcome the community members that are watching the live stream and start with introductions of those of us here this afternoon. My name's Nolene Duff and I'm the Chair of the Administrators, and I welcome Miguel Belmar.
Good afternoon.
And Mr. Cameron Boardman.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon.
And we also have with us this afternoon our Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Glenn Patterson. And we're joined by Jacinta McLeod, who's working with us on the administration of the meeting, and Jordan Barfoot on the technical side. So thank you for your assistance this afternoon. I'd like to start with acknowledging the statement of acknowledgement. The City of Casey proudly acknowledges the traditional owners, Casey's Aboriginal communities and their rich culture, and pays respect to their elders past, present and future. We acknowledge Aboriginal people as Australia's first peoples and as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we work and live. The diversity statement. The City of Casey is home to a remarkable diversity of cultures, languages, faiths, identities, landscapes and stories. From our first Australians to our most recent arrivals and every wave between, the City of Casey welcomes and represents all community members and their respective ambitions to live healthy, rewarding and happy lives. These intersecting and overlapping community stories form Casey's collective identity and contribute to its evolving rich history. We recognise this diversity as our strength and we aim to share, nurture and celebrate it. And I confirm that in line with the restrictions issued by the Victorian Government on public gatherings due to COVID-19, this meeting is being held virtually this afternoon and publicly live streamed. Thank you. I'd like to start with item 2 of the agenda, which is the confirmation of minutes of the council meeting held on the 4th of August 2020. Do I have a mover and seconder?
I'll move that.
Moved Mr. Belmar, seconded?
Seconded myself, Chair.
Mr. Boardman, thank you. I'll put that to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Thank you. Item 3, just Mr. Belmar, we've lost you on the screen, so I just want to confirm that you are present.
Yes, I certainly am.
Thank you. We've lost your video. Thank you. Item 3, declaration of interests. I have considered my obligations under section 79 of the Local Government Act 1989 and declare that I have no interests to be noted at this afternoon's meeting. I also note that there are no officers who've declared any interest. Do my fellow administrators have any interest to declare?
I also have nothing to declare, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman.
I have no interest to declare.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. Move to item 4, public question time. We do have one public question received for this afternoon's council meeting, and it is from Mr. Matthew Kerwin. The subject matter is improving future governance of Casey. And the question reads as follows. In her report in February 2020, Municipal Monitor Lorinda Gardner recommended that a thorough review and embedding of policies, procedures and processes for effective decision-making and responsibilities and the development and implementation of an extensive municipal-wide program to develop more and diverse community leaders and greater participation in setting a vision for Casey, more awareness and interest in local democracy, the role of council and the responsibility of councillors. My question is what has been done so far to achieve those recommendations and what is planned with timeframes for achieving them? I do have a fairly comprehensive response to Mr. Kerwin's question, so I will read through it. Council has undertaken several actions in response to the report tabled by the Municipal Monitor Lorinda Gardner in February 2020. This includes a report tabled at the council meeting on the 7th of April 2020 by me as the then interim administrator, which focused on a review of governance and integrity systems at the City of Casey and included a governance audit and action plan. The governance audit comprehensively covered all areas of council, including direction and leadership, culture and behaviour, structure, systems and policies, decision-making, communications and community engagement and capability. 14 actions were identified to be undertaken in response to the audit. One of the actions from the audit was the creation of a community leadership program to develop diverse community leaders by 2024. This action was incorporated into the council's current council plan annual action plan and is assigned to the relevant officer with a due date of the 30th of June 2021 for the program to begin. Also at the council meeting held on the 7th of April 2020, council endorsed a new policy titled Protocols for Councillors Land Use Planning, which reinforces council's role as planning authority in regard to the development of policy and strategy and changes to the Casey planning scheme and the responsible authority considering planning applications against the policies and controls within the Casey planning scheme, provides council with instruction and guidance on their important roles as planning authority and responsible authority, ensures decisions are not compromised by premature or ill-informed advice provided to proponents, applicants, objectors or submitters through consistent, transparent and accountable processes, and creates greater certainty and transparency for the community about council's role and decision-making processes, as well as the opportunity to engage with council as part of this. Building on the work mentioned above at this afternoon's council meeting, you'll see that there's a report which adopts council's governance rules, which clearly explain how council will make decisions, and a public transparency policy which outlines council's commitment to good governance, open and accountable conduct, and making council information publicly available. Thank you, Mr. Kerwin, for the question. Now we move to item 5, officers' reports, and there are 9 reports this afternoon, and I start with the first of those reports, which, as I referred to, is item 5.1, Local Government Act 2020, Stage 1 and 2 implementation. Can I have a mover for that report?
I will move that report, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. Seconder?
I will second that.
And Mr. Boardman, I invite you to speak to the report.
And that is a very nice segue, considering the answer you've just given to Mr. Kerwin's query around governance and improving some of the transparency and reporting frameworks to this municipality. And this is not just something that we have abided by, considering the amendments necessary by the new Local Government Act 2020, but we've looked at this from an exercise as not only, as I've mentioned, meeting our statutory obligations, but from a position of best practice and how we as administrators can set the organisation up for the future so that we are being exemplar of transparency, governance and process related requirements, and also providing it as a much more streamlined and effective organisation from council officers up to the executives and of course to ourselves as the panel of administrators. As I mentioned, that the new Local Government Act 2020 came into being early this year. It received royal assent on the 24th of March, and I would like to go on the record of acknowledging the role that the former Minister for Local Government, Adam Somyurek, had in drafting this legislation, and what I really think needs to be put on the record as a signature reform on behalf of this government. Local government reform has been something that's been contentious for some time. There's been various iterations of attempts to look at this from a holistic perspective, but to actually go through and have such a dedicated and detailed response from a statutory basis that's not just improved the reporting framework as it applies to all Victorian municipalities, but also makes it quite clear as to what the obligations and expectations of municipalities are, I think is a significant achievement. And I do acknowledge Mr. Somyurek's part in that and his department, and certainly the new Local Government Minister, Mr. Sean Lean, equally is approaching this particular exercise with rigour and the attention that it requires. So the 4 stages that is required for municipalities to comply with this Act, we are now in stage 3, with stage 1 and 2 being due on the 6th of April and the 1st of May of this year. And there are a number of instruments and requirements that need to be completed in order to do that. They're very extensive documents. So I can say from an administrator's perspective, we have reviewed each document in its entirety. There has been some significant amendments and reforms proposed by us through the consultative phase, but it has strengthened the veracity and the application of the documents, and hopefully gives the community a whole lot more confidence and understanding that we are very committed to our individual and collective responsibilities in this. There are instruments of delegations from the CEO, or from ourselves to the CEO, from ourselves to council staff. We certainly have a new council and expenses policy. There is an audit risk charter. There will be certain other additions to that charter as the composition of the Audit and Risk Committee becomes more clear over time. The public transparency policy, which complements the community engagement policy that we'll be talking about later in this agenda item, and the governance rules, which yourself, Chair, referenced in response to the aforementioned question. They are very dry for most people, but these are the documents which really set the behaviours and the expected conduct for us, and we take our role exceptionally seriously, not just in development, but how we will abide by the documents in the future. We have gone through a significant degree of public consultation, which is equally statutorily required, and we note in the council officers' reports of the number of times that has been downloaded, 811, and the number of times that they've been viewed, and not surprisingly, the most popular document for viewing from members of the community has been the council expenses policy. So with that introductory remarks, we are fulfilling our statutory obligations, but we are doing it from, as I said, a best practice context, and we are using this as an informed perspective to ensure that we not only meet those expectations, but we exceed the community's expectations throughout our tenure. So I'm very delighted to move the reports and the associated documents.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar, would you like to speak to the report?
Yes, in seconding this motion, I'm mindful that local government is dynamic, that local government needs to respond to challenges that are presented from time to time, and these policies do as Mr. Boardman has outlined. They are responsive to changes that were seen to be required, and we have carefully, or I have carefully considered the documents. They are perhaps somewhat dry, but they need to be, because they need to set out very carefully and succinctly the expectations that are had of members of the community that want to become involved in local government. And it's certainly part of the role that I see as a legacy role in ensuring that these documents are set in place for the longer term. In reviewing these documents, what I really just want to do is focus on one of them, and that is the transparency policy and the principles of transparency, or the principles for transparency, which these documents enshrine. And there are a couple of them that I just wish to put on the record from my part, and I'm sure on behalf of all the administrators. Council decision-making processes must be transparent, except where the council is dealing with information that is confidential by virtue of the Local Government Act or any other act. Council information must be publicly available unless the information is confidential by virtue of the act, of this act or any other act. The public availability of information would be contrary to the public interest, and further, that council information must be understandable and accessible to members of the municipal community. And public awareness of the availability of council information must be facilitated. My reflection on these particular policies are that it is important that local government and the City of Casey is transparent, but at the same time we're mindful of the responsibilities we have in dealing with sensitive information, and at all time be clear about that issue. So that transparency has to be carefully weighed in compliance with statute. And I am happy to second the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar, and you've both spoken comprehensively about this series of reports which implement our requirements under the new Local Government Act 2020. I think we have reviewed them in some detail and I certainly support them. So I put that motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried unanimously. Item 5.2, Strategic Land Use Planning Priorities for 2020-21. Do I have a mover?
Yes, I'll move that.
Mr. Belmar, thank you. Seconder? Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar, would you like to speak to the item?
Yes, I will. And if I just being paperless, I'm learning my way around the material.
Well done. Thank you.
Now, this is an important policy because what it does is that it sets out the work plan for our for one of the land use team within council. The document sets out that there will be 8 key objectives for 2021. They're set out in the material, but just very briefly touching on them, they are they'll be doing work that supports infrastructure delivery in growth areas and trial innovative delivery models. There'll be work that implements the planning services review to improve the planning service and customer experience. There'll be advocacy for state planning policy reform and implementation of planning policy that supports jobs and productivity, a facilitation of proponent-led proposals where possible, a continuation of community education and development of policies that promote protection of environment and heritage values, the development and implementation of an organisational approach to placemaking and strategic utilisation of council land, and a review and reform of strategic planning policy. So there is a number of projects that have been adopted and that will be undertaken by the planning team over the next year. It's not a matter of a planning team that only does statutory planning and looks at applications. This is a planning team that looks at further issues and how it can continuously improve how planning can be made to work for Casey. And so on that basis, I commend the work that has been set out for the next year.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman, would you like to speak?
No, thank you, Chair. There's not much I can add to Mr. Belmar's very precise summary.
Thank you. It is indeed a very comprehensive report. I'll put that motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Thank you. Item 5.3, Barry Simon Reserve Master Plan. Do I have a mover for the recommendation?
I will move this recommendation, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. Seconder? Mr. Belmar.
I'll second that.
Thank you. Mr. Boardman, would you like to speak to the master plan report?
I will make a very brief summary of the report because I think there's not much more I can add to the process, considering there has been 1,400 visits to the Casey Conversations page to look at the master plan and to review its contents, which resulted in some significant feedback, but primarily 3 submissions. The investment from council to upgrade the facilities for the various football, cricket and other sporting clubs and teams and a general community recreational sense as well is over $1.7 million, which includes upgrades to roadworks, the terrace, pedestrian access, screen existing bedding closures. There's some landscape works. There's upgrades to the cricket nets. There's water sensitivity, urban design requirements, including stormwater retention capacities. There's a playground renewal. There's a new playground, lighting, and other community amenities such as a drinking fountain, new rubbish bins, and fencing and so forth. I could imagine that this will be a very popular 20-year project that will not only improve the amenity of the facility, but provide greater recreational and community facilities as a consequence. And it's one of those vital projects that we are doing in a growth environment that really makes Casey that much more of a livable community. So I'm delighted to move the recommendation report.
Thank you for those comments. Mr. Belmar, would you like to add anything?
No, I I commend the motion. I note that it has been of interest, and there's been 1,400 visits to the site, as Mr. Boardman has set out, and I otherwise commend the work that's been done by council officers in putting together a plan which will be, in many respects, very easy for the community to follow and to understand the work that will be done. And it's important that the work is presented in that way so that the community is aware of the long-term vision for a very important council facility. And I second the motion.
Thank you. I'll put that motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.4, the Community Engagement Policy. We have a report. Do I have a mover?
Yes, I'll move that.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. Seconder? Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar.
Yes, this is part of the continuing work that Council is doing in accordance with the Local Government Act, and having a reflection on the officer's report that's been provided to us. This policy is being developed and covers the following elements: an overview of the types and forms of engagement that Casey will use, an outline of how Casey will close the loop on engagement opportunities. The policy will include representative and deliberative engagement practices, include engagement principles in accordance with the Local Government Act, and be capable of being applied to local laws, budget and policy development. A policy such as this is fundamentally important because it lets the community know the ways in which it can engage with Council, but also lets the community know that Council is actively reviewing how it will engage. And when I read the policy itself, at part 5 of the policy, why we engage, the principles of why cases are adopting this policy are set out there. I can just briefly touch on those. At the City of Casey, we believe that people who are impacted by activities should have an opportunity to provide feedback or have input into the decision-making process. As a council, our engagement can help create the following benefits: making more informed decisions, better understanding the needs and priorities of our diverse communities and stakeholder, creating greater transparency and trust, support genuine and meaningful conversations, and I could continue. But really, the principles that it sets out are that this is a council that wants to engage with its community, is adopting policies that represent that and give strength to that commitment, and I commend the policy.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman, would you like to add any further comments?
Briefly, Chair, this is an example of where we have tried to go beyond merely meeting our statutory obligations, and as I referenced in my comments around item 5.1, trying to take a best practice and exemplar approach to our interactions with our community and how we reference the community's feedback and concerns with our decision making. And when we've been having this discussion around formulating all aspects of our communication, from internal challenge to external challenges, channels to dealing with government at various levels, the constant measure that we have determined our success is how we can better articulate the feedback and the information we're receiving through those channels in a direct correlated decision-making basis. And looking in the policy, and as Mr. Belmar has referenced some of the reasons why we communicate, if we go to specifically some of the channels and the methods that we adopt on page 17, and there's a number of those aspects that are referenced, there's one in particular that really stands out to me, and that's the Casey Conversations channel, which is quite significant insofar as ourselves as administrator receiving the feedback from the community is what comes through that, when questions are asked, when petitions are raised, when other matters are brought to the council and ultimately the administrator's attention, that we now work in a completely, almost exclusively digitalised environment. And so that's required this organisation and other organisations to adapt to not just technology, but the wishes and the views of the community and the expectations on how we respond and why we respond. And so not just meeting those obligations that we have to under the Local Government Act, it's important that we use this from an evaluation perspective, from a continuous improvement, and that we're always providing reference checks and reference points as to when communities provide us with feedback and information that might not always be seen to be influencing our strategic and policy outcomes. We've had a couple of examples of those recently, but I think from the basic tenets of communication, we've always been fair yet firm in responding to the community on why decisions have been made, perhaps contrary to some members of the community's views. So this is the template and the framework that we will be abiding by in the future, and it's one that we take from a responsibility basis, as Mr. Belmar has said, specifically quite seriously, and for those reasons I'm very pleased to second the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. And I certainly agree with the comments you've both made. I think this is an important platform against which the community can really look at our performance as an organisation, particularly over the coming years where we'll be, the coming year where we'll be undertaking a council planning exercise. We'll be looking at that forward look and forecasting what our commitments will be over the next term of council. So thank you for those considered comments. I put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.5, backing business in Casey business grants program. Do I have a mover, please?
I will move this this recommendation, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman, and a seconder, Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman?
So very brief comments around this. We don't need to go into too much detail around the impacts from current lockdowns associated with COVID. We know those impacts. We know that it is having widespread and significant trauma to certain sectors of our community, but most particularly to the business community. I don't think any of us in our lifetime would envisage a scenario where business was not able, particularly in a free market economy such as Australia, where business was unable to trade freely and was forced to, in the overwhelming majority of cases, close due to government edict. We've discussed this extensively internally. We made a number of budget measures so far as how we can better support our local community. One of which is the business grants program that we have articulated in the council papers today, and the backing business in Casey support package. On the surface, this may actually seem like a relatively modest investment, but it is the first investment that we have made in response to circumstances much beyond our control, and I'm quite certain that it won't be the last measure. In addition to this direct assistance that we have provided to business, there are a number of other budgetary measures that we've implemented insofar as trying to be considerate and genuinely empathetic to situations where rates are unable to be paid or where there has been a request for extensions or other mitigating circumstances, but to provide the direct support that this particular program articulates to try and give business clarity over some of their obligations, to provide a support platform where they can think about ideas and look at other alternatives. It's just part of an overall scheme that this particular council, and I trust other municipalities in the state and national governments as a whole, are looking to assist business communities. There are a number of initiatives that I won't go into the detail specifically because they are significant initiatives that do speak for themselves. But as a threshold issue and looking at how ourselves, an administrator and the council, can better serve its business community in the future, I do say that these are one of a number of measures that we are going to look at. It is a first step investment, and we will be looking at other investments and measures in the future, depending, of course, upon what is the most applicable and represents the greatest value. But it is an indication of the genuine commitment and concern that us as administrators, and certainly the council as a whole, has to our business community, and where we can best represent those interests, provide support, and try and look at where any feedback, any aspects that we are receiving from the business community can formulate in the future additional support and policy levers. So I do thank the council officers for responding in such a timely fashion. I trust that the Casey business community will take up the various offers and initiatives that are in the overall package. And for those reasons, I do commend the report and the recommendation to the panel.
Thank you. Mr. Belmar, would you like to speak to this report?
Yes, just some brief remarks. And first thing, I apologise for the noise perhaps that came through from the background of my my microphone. It's part of doing these things from a domestic situation. Further to Mr. Boardman's comments, it is important to recognise the multiple steps that Council has taken to respond to COVID. This is another one of them. When I read the document, what comes through to me is the reasonably broad eligibility criteria, which means that the Council is recognising that there are a number of different types and sizes of businesses that operate within the City of Casey. And I encourage all small businesses within the City of Casey to take up the opportunity to investigate their eligibility and also to engage further with Council to discuss and investigate manners in which Council will continue to respond to the challenges that are put forward by the current health situation. And I commend the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar, and I think we acknowledge the very, very challenging and difficult circumstances that many small businesses, particularly in our community, are experiencing with COVID and the various trading restrictions. So I do commend officers for the thoughtfulness in which they've approached framing this grants program, and I agree. I hope we do get a very strong response. I'm sure we will from our business community. I'll put that motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. We have a couple of fairly procedural reports. Item 5.6, disposal of land, Valletta Street, Clyde. Do I have a mover for this report? Mr. Belmar and a seconder. Mr. Boardman. Thank you, Mr. Belmar.
Yes, Chair, as you have outlined, these are reasonably procedural motions. The first motion relates to a parcel of land at 6 Valletta Street. I have considered the material. I've considered the subdivision drawings that are attached to it. It is appropriate that this matter go forward, as has been identified by council officers carefully in their assessment. This is a parcel of land which can be dealt with in the manner proposed in this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman, any comments?
I have nothing further to add.
Thank you, and this is the beginning of the statutory process. So I'll put that motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. And item 5.7, road discontinuance, Central Parkway, Cranbourne West. Do I have a mover?
Yes, I move that.
Mr. Belmar again, and Mr. Boardman seconded. Mr. Belmar, I invite you to speak.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Again, this is a procedural motion with respect to a statutory process. Council has carefully considered, council officers have carefully considered the continuing requirement for this parcel of land, and this is the start of a statutory process that could result in the disposal of the land in an appropriate way and through the appropriate statutory channels. And just reflecting on it, it shows that council is always carefully considering and listening to the community when issues like this arise, when there can be an appropriate disposal of land. I commend the motion both for this particular instance, but also overall commend council officers for the manner in which they continue to respond to the community.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman, would you like to speak to this item?
I think Mr. Belmar has more than adequately surmised the resolution, so I'm happy to second it. Okay,
we'll put that motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Move to item 5.8, the Crib Point Gas Input Jetty and Pipeline Project Environmental Effects Statement. And do I have a mover?
I will move that.
Mr. Boardman, and seconded Mr. Belmar.
I'll second that.
Thank you. Mr. Boardman.
Chair, I may take a little bit of time to go through this submission and the position of the council, and to also espouse the rationale on why we're actually making a submission. There has been some significant media, even in the last 24 hours, regarding this particular issue, and it is one that has a significant amount of emotion. It has some complexities and differentiation of views. It is also one that needs to be looked through a holistic context, which unfortunately through some of the lenses of the emotional debate are lost in some part as to what the actual process represents. This has also been quite a...
Can I just before you do proceed, can I just clarify the motion on the screen? I understood you did discuss with me some amendments that you had, and I'm not sure that the items on the screen present that. So could I just suggest you review those?
That is correct. I do have an amendment I'd like to move, and I'll ask the Chief Executive Officer if we have a copy of that amendment to put on the screen, or would the panel prefer if I read it out?
I think if you have it in front of you, it would be preferable for you to read it out. Okay.
So I would like to propose an amendment to the recommendation, and it is primarily to the second point of the recommendation. So the recommendation, my amendment, I'll read as whole, that council endorses the council officer's submission to the Crib Point Gas Import Jetty and Pipeline Project Environmental Effects Statement as per attachment 1, and that council officers, upon being invited to present at the IAC public hearing scheduled to commence Monday 12th October 2020, they will present the issues raised in the submission on behalf of the Casey community in a fair, factual and balanced manner. And I'd like to move that amendment standing in my name.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. And Mr. Belmar, do I confirm that you are still happy to second that?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. I'll invite you to speak, Mr. Boardman, and I think Ms. McLeod is amending the item on the screen, but I'll ask you to proceed with your comments. Thank you.
So whilst I do that, I will take the liberty just to read what is on the screen, and that is correct. So I'm going to deal with the substantive motion and the amendment as a whole, if the panel is happy to proceed on that basis. And I will continue my comment saying that this has been a reasonable education from my perspective on the nuances of local government and in fact the role of local government overall. I have approached this particular submission from two bases. One is to look at what my input into a process which fundamentally needs to be something that reflects the overall viewpoints of the organisation and not just myself as an individual administrator and or the panel of administrators as a group of individuals, but also as to how we can, from an organisational perspective, provide a better outcome that not only represents all of the varying differences of opinions that exist within this particular debate, but also looks at the underlying factor as to why this process has commenced in the first place. And if we take the emotion out of what has been omnipresent to a number of other municipalities without casting dispersions or being specific at this stage, it comes down to a very simple premise, that what Casey is dealing with as a consequence of the proposed project is a pipeline that goes somewhere through the bottom part of the municipal boundaries up to a proposed new transfer station in Pakenham. And that's really what it comes down to. This is, from our perspective, a pipeline proposal. But it's also something that if you refer, if I could, Chair, to page 413 of the submission, and this is, I'm not saying the submission itself has 413 pages, but it's 413 insofar as the documents. We make the point quite clearly that the pipeline permit and the county planning scheme considerations, that they do not trigger the requirement from a planning permit. So it really comes down to what role are we trying to effect by putting in a submission for a project which is simply, as I said, a pipeline underground through various parts of the municipality. Now, we have identified that there is some under the initial proposal, private land that's impacted upon the route of the pipeline that will need to be addressed. And there's other matters such as vegetation and potential other issues that have been raised by my colleague, Mr. Belmore, on traffic disruption, particularly from a construction phase, and some other impacts upon existing council policy. But if we strip back the emotion and the facts as they are, this is a pipeline project that traverses the Casey municipality. But let's actually go to what we are trying to achieve here. And whilst we acknowledge that that's a much more oversimplified view of what this project represents, we also need to be quite conscious that we do play, because of the unique geographic positioning of the municipal boundaries, a significant part in what this project is trying to achieve. And it really strikes me as quite interesting that if I read the submissions of other neighbouring municipalities, and I will single out the Mornington Peninsula Shire in this regard, and I do it from a basis that I understand they debated this issue last night at their council meeting. I have not had the chance to review the recording of the council meeting, but I have read their submission. I have read the council's recommendations, but I understand that it was unanimously opposed for this particular project to continue. And it was quite strong language in the submission around why they thought it would be appropriate to oppose the position. But what I find really extraordinary from the Mornington Peninsula Shire's perspective, which is in complete contrast to how Casey, in particular, our Casey council officers have approached this submission and the role of Casey and how we're going to represent our community, is that there is a total absence of recognition of why this project has been proposed in the first place and what the project is actually seeking to do. And you would have to be completely and utterly with your head in the sand at every level not to understand that there has been, since the 19th of April 2017, a holistic report into the national gas situation through the ACCC, which has had its terms of reference extended by the Treasurer last year to 2025, which is dealing with all of the issues of gas market regulation, of supply, of pricing, and of demand, and is now, as a consequence of the interim report that was released yesterday, looking at a much wider timeline beyond 2025 up to 2030 and 2035. So to look at the cover picture of that, this is something that is responsive to a national inquiry. It is also something that's been covered quite comprehensive in the gas statement of opportunities that came out in March this year from the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO. That to not even mention this in a submission as to the reason and the rationale why the project is going ahead, I find is quite irresponsible. But I want to go in a bit more detail as to what the ACCC and what AEMO have said. So at a high level, AEMO has made it quite clear that Victoria will have a gas supply shortage as early as 2024. Now, the report, the GSSO, the gas statement of opportunity, has made some assumptions based upon various scenarios that if there is a fast track of renewal replacements to deal with fossil fuels and to look at some demand reduction strategies, and if there is other market corrections, whether that's going to be impacted by disruption and other dysfunctionality that exists in the international markets as a consequence of COVID, then that's going to have impact upon what's going to happen in 2024 at varying levels. But it is without doubt that at a very high level, that on supply and exploration market indicators, that Victoria's supply from a basic exploration perspective will not meet community expectations by that trigger of 2024. But if you correlate that to where the ACCC's report yesterday makes it quite clear, and I'm going to quote this directly.
Mr. Boardman, I trust you're weaving this back to related to our submission.
Absolutely, I am.
Thank
the
you.
risk of shortfall, particularly in the south, now appears even greater following the significant fall in oil prices and increasing reliance on producers that are placing on supplying gas from underdeveloped reserves. So we have two reports. One's part of an ongoing inquiry, one's part of from the energy market that are identifying that there is a need to deal with what ultimately is going to be a crisis in the East Coast, particularly the southeast coast gas supplies, by a not too distant trigger point in the future. So what the submission has done is to look at this from a holistic perspective, not just taking in consideration some of the issues that were raised in the ESS, which was only one part of the argument and one part of the process, but to look at the project rationale from a perspective as to why is this project necessary, how does it impact upon the municipality, what does it mean from an overall regulatory basis, and what really is the role for council in any context. And the point that we've made in this submission quite clearly, which is the basis of the recommendation, is that the project needs to be considered from a position of national importance. It is not for one municipality over another or a group of municipalities to be determining the project rationale, the necessity, the scope of the project, the environmental effects, or any other aspects in isolation. All of those impacts need to be considered as a concurrence. And I think that what we have done by drafting this submission to be as comprehensive as we can by identifying some very legitimate concerns that impact upon Casey, concerns that are not just in line with Casey's policies, but with other national frameworks, but looking at the balanced perspective between the demand-driven and the supply limitation aspects, I think we've come up with a really good job that does position us quite differently from some of our neighbouring municipalities, and probably is something that may even go as far as being unique to local government in a whole context. But we make the point quite clear that because of the variancing in some of the research and reports, not just the ESS, but also the Environment Victoria report, and also those reports promoted by the ACCC and EMO, that one thing that does need to be addressed that is not clear in the current process is why those discrepancies exist, why there is conflicting scientific and other information, and to actually provide a factual basis as to what the real situation is. And that, I think, is the least that we can do on behalf of the Casey municipality. So by drafting a report that looks clearly from the viewpoint of all of the issues that are raised in the ESS and through extensive community consultation, and to provide that factual and evidence-based response as to what the real impacts are, I think that balance has been achieved quite nicely. We do want this to be the first part of the process. There are going to be further public hearings. This ultimately is going to be something that will be decided by the state, and it's going to be consistent with national policy. We can't ask for much more than that. But from a best practice perspective, and this, I go back to my opening comments around the education to myself, it's very difficult, I think, for individual councillors and individual councils to be not looking at the total sum of all the factors that impact upon an infrastructure project, particularly one that's got such significant consequences as this one. And if they do go down such a pathway, I think they're being somewhat disingenuous to their own communities. If that was the approach that every council took, then from my perspective, it would be almost impossible for any large-scale development of any consequence to be successful in the future. So I make those comments, Chair, just on the basis of what the real situation as to why Casey is involving itself in this process, and to how we as administrators have inputted into this process, that we've come up with what we think is a much fairer balance, and as I've said in my amendment, factual position. And I trust that this is the first of many iterations that we will have with the IAP, with the process itself, and that if the state and the national government do decide that this particular project, in comparison with all other alternatives that exist, both from a demand reduction perspective and also alternative infrastructure development basis, is the project to proceed, then we will approach that with fairness, complying with our legislative requirements, but ensuring that all stakeholders, community and elsewise, are represented equitably as possible. And with those comments, Chair, I will move the Casey submission to this process.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar, do you have any comments as seconder?
Yes, I just have a few brief comments and observations. Firstly, I take a very practical approach to this submission. This submission is an opportunity for Casey to have a seat at the table at a public inquiry that will occur later this year. It will ensure that the interests of our residents are advocated for at that inquiry, and that we're present at all times at the inquiry to ensure that matters that in the long term can affect Casey will be carefully considered by the panel, because the experts on the Casey planning scheme, being our officers, will be present at that hearing. The second issue I'd like to briefly comment on is that the submission is a carefully considered document, and reflecting on the expertise that's been used to put it together, I commend the officers for the schedules that are attached to the submission, which carefully set out the Casey planning scheme and those parts of the planning scheme which are directly impacted by the proposed development. And as Mr. Boardman has set out, this is essentially a pipeline through Casey. It is a development which, if it goes ahead, Casey can respond to. We have a robust planning scheme that will be able to properly address issues that arise. And ultimately, the other matters that are of concern to me in the third part of these comments I'd like to make is that one of the greatest impacts that this project can have on Casey, if it goes ahead, is during the construction phase. The municipality of Casey is a growing municipality. It has significant stress on its road network. I'm sure that the members of our community are more than aware of that. This is a project that will take many years to build, and it is absolutely vital that in any assessment of this project, that the impact, the direct impact that will be had on our residents and their daily use and traverse of our roads is carefully considered by the panel, and I'm confident that our officers will be present at the hearing to put forward that position. I otherwise commend the motion.
Thank you both. I know that there has been considerable work that has been undertaken by officers, but also by the panel with respect to the appraisal of this and input, and I think it's been a very good exercise. So I'll put this motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried unanimously. We have one final report this afternoon, and that's item 5.9, Quarter 4 Quarterly Community Report. Do I have a mover for that report?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. Moved and seconded. Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar, please speak to the report.
Yes, I will just make some brief remarks. This is a report that provides to the community a assessment of the work that's been performed this year in compliance with the Council Action Plan. So it's a report that looks back at 2019 and 2020 and describes the work that's been carried out. It's obviously important to recognise that this year has been a year that's been unfortunately disturbed by COVID and its impacts on the community. But nevertheless, when I read this report, what is clear to me is that the work that was set out at the start of last year by Council has almost in its entirety been completed. There are still some matters that require completion, but it is clear to me reading this material, this report, that Council has done its best in trying circumstances to achieve its work program for the 2019-2020 year. And through this document, which is now available to the community, Council sets out those parts that have been achieved and how they've been achieved. And I commend the report, and I commend the officers of Council who have continued working through very trying circumstances to continue to achieve the work program that they set out for themselves last year, when no one had any idea that we would be at home working remotely and working in other fashions. And it shows that Council staff has been able to appropriately adapt to the challenges and achieve the program that they've set out to achieve for themselves.
Thank you.
And I commend the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Belmar. Mr. Boardman, do you have any comments as seconder?
The only comments, Chair, is that it's good to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. And considering we've been talking about governance rules and transparency frameworks and community engagement strategies, well, here's an example of, I'd like to say this is one we prepared earlier. But what's quite significant in this report, which goes to that key issue of transparency and being honest, is that there is a number of initiatives that we set out to achieve that haven't been completed. And the status of their various completions, whether they've been deferred or simply not completed, the council's been quite open about that and has put in reasons as to why that is the case. I don't think from a community expectation perspective you can ask for much more than that, but it is a living example of where we are being true to our words and to attempt as best as possible to provide honest and consistent and detailed feedback to the community against plans that we initiated, and it is a benchmark that we will continue to abide by in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. And I also support the report. I think it is for those members of the community who do like to take some time, it is a good read. It does comprehensively provide an overview of the work of council and obviously is a contributor to the annual reporting cycle as well. So I'll put that motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. That's the conclusion of officer reports. I move to item 6, the consideration of reports of committees, and I note the record of discussion as listed in the agenda papers, that be received and noted. Item 7, petitions. We have no petitions this afternoon for council's consideration. Item 8 is urgent business and there is none. And so that leaves me with one task this afternoon, and that is to declare the meeting closed. I thank you all for joining the meeting. I thank the administrators this afternoon for their comprehensive input into the discussion, and to those officers. So I bid you farewell and wish you good afternoon. Thank you, everyone.